Hello and welcome to the National Museum of the American Indians Professional Development Series, Native New York in Your Classroom. Thanks so much for joining us. I'm Amy Temerance and I'm the lead cultural interpreter at the museum. Native New York in Your Classroom is a free 4-part webinar series designed for education professionals who teach about the Native nations of New York State. And this series is tied to an upcoming exhibition called Native New York, which will be on view at our museum in New York City in 2021. We'll be posting a link in our chat today where you can learn more about this exhibition. Let's go ahead and talk about our plan for today. In today's webinar, we'll be talking about the history of problematic narratives about Native Americans, its impact on society, and why that matters today. We'll conclude with an introduction of the museum's National Education Initiative, Native Knowledge 360. I'd like to now introduce the facilitator for today's session, Ed Shootman. Ed is the manager of national education at the National Museum of the American Indian. He works at the museum's location in Washington, D.C. Ed began his career in education for and about Native Americans in 1988, working with Native American schools, states, and federal agencies, and other organizations across the United States. He joined the staff of education at our museum in 2004.
Thanks a lot, Amy, for the introduction, and hi, everyone. I'm excited and honored today to share some of our education work here at the National Museum of the American Indian. But first, I want to say that we know that you've been faced with unprecedented circumstances and extreme challenges to the work of education this year, more than usual. And we want to offer our sincere respect and appreciation for rising to those challenges and continuing the work of educating the next generation of all young Americans. So whoever you are and wherever you're from, I welcome you and say Mado. Thank you for spending this time with us. Feeling a sense of belonging is important for each and every one of us. And for many Native and Indigenous people, belonging is often tied to their ancestral homelands. And those ties to homelands include relationships with those environments, memories of communities, and a long, very long history of cultural experiences. These relationships to place can be very complex. I'm a citizen of the Muskogee Creek Nation of Oklahoma, and a recent event occurred with my tribe that has to do with our ever-changing relationship with the land. The original Muskogee homelands were located in what's now Georgia and Alabama. In the 1830s, most of Muskogee people were removed to Indian Territory, or what is now Oklahoma. These new lands were supposed to be ours forever, but that promise wasn't honored. Without going into the long and complicated legal history of this, recently, the United States Supreme Court ruled that our lands in Oklahoma were taken illegally from us. And as a result, our legal jurisdiction now extends once again over a wide area of eastern Oklahoma, and our tribal sovereignty has been reaffirmed. So our relationship with the land is an ongoing and evolving story. We think that this trend with land acknowledgements that we see happening in the country today is very positive. Indigenous peoples are the original stewards of the lands on which we now live and work. And so I would like to just say that at NMAI, we always acknowledge the Native peoples on whose ancestral homelands we gather, as well as the diverse and vibrant Native communities who make their homes here today. And a couple of other thoughts about land acknowledgements. Although they're a very positive, they're a first step towards what we hope will become more collaborative, accountable, and respectful relationships with Native communities. And for you educators out there, we think it would be really great If all US history teachers, say, started their classes with a land acknowledgement, imagine what a tone that would set for your year, that this is not just going to be a single narrative, that this is a place where we honor diverse perspectives and include Native voice from day one. So to get us started, we'd like you to help us develop a word cloud. And we're going to show you a question on your screen. When you think of Native Americans, what are some of the things, the images or terms that come to your mind? Now, there's no right or wrong answer here. We just want to know what pops into your mind. So what you need to do, you can use another browser or another tab on your browser and go to menti.com. You use the code that's here on the screen, 4803040, and you'll be able to enter that term. So if we could ask you to do that, join us in this activity, and we'll be able to view the results in a few minutes. You just go to menti.com, enter the code 4803040, and we'll come back and take a look at the results of that word cloud in just a few minutes. And while you're working on that, I'd like to tell you a little bit about the National Museum of the American Indian. We're part of the Smithsonian Institution. The Smithsonian is a complex of a lot of museums, libraries, a zoo, and research centers. The National Museum of the American Indian has 2 exhibition locations. One is in Washington, D.C. on the National Mall. The other is in New York City in Lower Manhattan. We hope you've had a chance to visit that one, but both of them at some point. And our museum collection of over 800,000 objects is cared for at the Cultural Resources Center in Suitland, Maryland. I'd like to just tell you quickly our mission statement, because we work in partnership with Native peoples and their allies to foster a richer shared human experience through a more informed understanding of Native peoples. And our vision statement is focused on equity and social justice for the Native peoples of the Western Hemisphere through education, inspiration, and empowerment. One of the common questions that we get at the National Museum of the American Indian is why are we called Museum of the American Indian? Why not some other term? And this is a really good question. It's American Indian is a general way to describe the indigenous cultures, and particularly those of North America. First Nations is used in Canada, Alaska Natives in Alaska, and Indigenous is often used in Central and South America. The most appropriate term to use is the name that the tribes themselves use when possible. But currently there are 574 federally recognized tribes in the United States alone. Each of them has its own history, culture, and language. When you think about the entire hemisphere, you can understand why a term like American Indian or Native American is inadequate but necessary to describe groups of people together. So we'll be using those terms today during the presentation. So let's see if we can check in with our word cloud activity and take a look at the results for that. So I'm seeing a lot of terms. What's interesting about word clouds is that those that get the most number of responses become the bigger words on screen. So you're seeing nature, and a lot of people associate Native Americans with nature, with place, with the natural world. Heritage, land, powwow, I'm seeing genocide as a term, feathers, trail of tears. And it's really fantastic to see these terms and to watch this word cloud build as we talk about it. I see beautiful and some very positive terminology, and I appreciate your responses to this. I think we'll go ahead and move on back to our slide deck. We're using this word cloud today activity to get us started thinking about the topic that I'm going to be discussing. Part of our work with Native Knowledge 360 is focused on breaking down stereotypes, false, incomplete, and even racist narratives that people have learned about Native Americans. We want to help educators view Native peoples through a new lens in ways that they might not have thought of before, so that their teaching can become more accurate, more inclusive, and more comprehensive. These are really extraordinary times for us to have a chance to meet with you today. There are such momentous things happening around our world, of course, beyond the devastating effects of the COVID-19 pandemic. In the spring, a brutal and deadly act of violence was caught on camera, witnessed by millions of people, and that really awakened a massive new consciousness about the ongoing presence and effects of systemic racism, and really energized a movement that not only recognized racism, but encourages those who believe in social justice to act, to become, in effect, anti-racist, and to engage in the long overdue and necessary work to end racism and to bring equity and justice for all those who suffer its effects. In the early days of this movement, the Native American experience was largely missing from that conversation. But with time, we began to see some of that change. And there are some remarkable things happening. We've seen monuments that embody racist principles and memories coming down. Across the country, statues and memorials to Christopher Columbus, the lost voyager who enslaved actually and brutalized Native peoples of the Caribbean, are coming down. There's been growing social and economic pressure on American sports teams to rid themselves of racist mascots. And here in Washington, D.C., where I'm located, we saw one of the most visible of those terms go away this year. After decades, really decades of work and advocacy to get rid of that mascot, finally has gone away. So these are all signs of great hope, but in some ways we also have to recognize that they are symbolic acts. The really hard work, the much harder work that remains to be done, is to get at the roots of racism. And it's those roots of racist views toward Native Americans that I'd like to examine with you today. So we're going to explore that topic from an education viewpoint. I want to try to deconstruct that educational history for you, its origins, effects, and how we're working to address the issue here at NMAI. Equity and social justice for Native Americans have long been hampered by disparaging terminology and inaccurate, incomplete, and inappropriate narratives that have been imposed upon them. So I'm going to be talking about some of these historical narratives about Native Americans, the language, the terms, and while there are hundreds of them that we could have chosen, I've selected a few to serve as the examples. Disparaging terminology started very early on. Here we see an example from the 15th century. The powerful Catholic Church of the 15th and 16th centuries issued edicts, or papal bulls, to leaders of Catholic European countries who were sponsoring the explorations of Africa, Asia, and of course the Americas. And basically what they are saying is if you're not Christian, if you are Saracen, which is I think an older term for Muslim peoples, or pagans was everybody else, or the indigenous peoples of the world, the church sanctioned taking your lands and property, enslaving your people. And We know that one of the deepest roots of racism lies in the desire for economic gain, for nation and empire building. Here we have some derogatory and racist language that continued among earlier European colonials into the earliest formal documents of the United States. The Declaration of Independence, of course, begins with one of the most aspirational democratic statements, that we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. And yet when we scroll down the page a little further, we find that the view towards Native Americans at the time is articulated, where it complains that England's King George is now stirring up the merciless Indian savages of the frontier. Here's a letter that was written to James Duane by George Washington. And it's discussing the advisability of purchasing Indian lands rather than taking them by force. George Washington, even in this private communication, uses the term savages, compares Native American behavior to the wild beasts of the forest, to wolves and beasts of prey. James Duane was a revolutionary leader actually from New York. He was a member of the Second Continental Congress, a former mayor of New York City, and a senator from New York. About 50 years later, in a speech before Congress, President Jackson argues for the passage of the American Indian Removal Act. Here he's using racist and patronizing language and pseudo-benevolent arguments to justify the taking of American Indian lands in the East and the removal of over 100,000 Native people west of the Mississippi to what was known as Indian Territory. But I think that Jackson knew really pretty well that his rhetoric didn't match reality. He had traveled extensively and conducted warfare across the Southeast for many years. Native Americans were not only his formidable enemies, their leaders were smart politicians. They were diplomats and orators. And by this time, for several centuries already, they had managed and resisted the mounting pressures created by three competing European powers, colonial America, and finally the United States. Jackson knew that Native people were, at that time, adapting to the world around them. Native children were educated in schools, some in Europe. Native Americans in the Southeast operated representational governments under written constitutions. They had their own laws, justice, and punitive systems. They participated in trade. They owned businesses, livestock, and they farmed as they always had. And according to the Cherokee Nation, about 90% of Cherokees at the time were literate in reading and writing the Cherokee language using the syllabary they had developed. So again, we'd like to ask you to participate with us. Maybe now we can ask you to jump on your chat and your keyboard and answer this question for us briefly. Why do you think this type of language about Native Americans persisted for so long? We just heard examples that spanned 3 centuries, over 3 centuries. And why do you think that kind of terminology persisted? Economics, white supremacy, it became part of the story. Everyone just accepted it as a justification for taking the land, the doctrine of discovery. This is a good, well-educated group of people on this session today, to dehumanize and make them appear inferior, keeping them as the other in order to dehumanize, different religious beliefs. These are wonderful answers. Lack of acceptance of differences. Thank you all so much. And for those responses, and they're right on. Such language ultimately served the true purpose of the United States and other governments, because it is easier to justify the displacement and decimation of people who are feared by the masses, or people who are considered inferior and somehow unsophisticated. Sometimes we'll hear people talk about the romanticized depictions of Native Americans that really became also institutionalized beliefs of 19th and 20th century American society. So how have these historical views and narratives been reflected in education? I think a good way for us to answer that question is to look at some textbooks. And we're going to go back in history a little bit, in textbook history. We're going to start with an example from 1904. The Principles of Geography, published in 1904 by Richard Elwood Dodge, who was a professor from Columbia University, describes the 4 great races of the world. I'm going to read this text as you view its summary here on screen. And as we do, I'd like to encourage you to think about the words you're hearing. Imagine that I'm your teacher. Maybe you're one of those students in a class in 1904, and that you're listening to this explanation of the races of the world. And we'll think about what the educational implications are. So the white race. The largest number of people belong to the Caucasian or white race. The members of this race have oval faces, small mouths and lips, large narrow noses, and straight eyes. They are the most active, enterprising, and imaginative race of the world. The yellow race. The next largest race of people is found in the yellow race, which the people of the yellow race are shorter than those of the white race. They have coarse black hair, small noses, small black eyes, and with corners a little elevated. As a rule, they are not progressive and include some of the most backward tribes of the world. The red race, the third great race, is the American or red race. The people of the red race have a yellowish copper-colored skin, long coarse black hair, small round eyes, and are about the height of the white race. Most of the red race are but little civilized, although a few are just beginning to develop industries which will furnish products of value to the rest of the world. And finally, the black race. The fourth and last group of people is the black or Negro race. The Negroes that we know in this country have a dark brown or black skin, short black kinky hair, very broad flat noses, etc. As a race, they are somewhat indolent, like other peoples whose homes are in tropical countries. They are often impulsive in their actions, but are faithful and affectionate to anyone for whom they care. So, it's over 100 years ago, and I've been reading this description to educators for several years now. It still is painful for me to read these things. But there's nothing subtle about this text, is there? The message that students take away is that white people are superior to all others. It's in everything, in the order of presentation and the descriptions of the characteristics. People such as these who wrote these were rooted in the inherited attitudes and beliefs. At this time, these attitudes were justified by the pseudoscience called eugenics. It's an exemplary of the prevalent white supremacist values of the time. Native Americans in particular are characterized as primitive and unsophisticated, lacking in culture, but just starting to produce something of value. And of course, the statement is completely ignorant of so many of the agricultural, engineering, environmental, governmental, and other achievements, accomplishments, and contributions that had served Native and other cultures for many centuries. Let's take a look at another example. This one comes to us from 1916. Again, I'll read it very quickly. Columbus, supposing that he had reached the Indies or southeastern Asia, called the savages who met him Indians. North America was an almost empty continent, waiting for the white man to come and fill it with people. Okay, again, nothing subtle here. The message is that North America was largely an empty wilderness before the arrival of Europeans. This, of course, is the American narrative, the concept of manifest destiny and the heroic building of a country. Still positions Native people as savages and seems pretty ignorant in light of the fact that North America, and indeed the entire Western Hemisphere, was far from empty at the time of Columbus's arrival, and that it had been populated by many diverse and unique cultures since time immemorial. So friends, we're only a few generations removed from these kinds of overt statements. Imagine millions of young children, American children, heard, believed, and lived their lives with these messages firmly instilled in their minds. They passed it on from generation to generation. Psychologists tell us that these types of messages, when they're learned, they actually wire the structure of our brains to accept them as truth or normal, and to also be resistant to any other ideas that counter those messages. That's how things become institutionalized, and these racist attitudes and beliefs are extremely difficult to counter and change once they're ingrained. Now, just to add some more perspective, the United States was doing its best in the late 19th and early 20th centuries to eradicate Native American cultures and languages through the so-called assimilationist policies and civilization acts. It only takes a little bit of empathy to recognize the impact it must have had on young Native American children to read narratives such as these. Many of our elders tell us that they were taught to be ashamed of being Native American. And although these federal policies and practices ultimately failed, they had disastrous and long-term consequences that still persist in Native American communities today. Well, let's jump ahead a few decades. Now we're in the 1950s. The language here has changed somewhat. Here, the authors of A History of the American People say that some Americans looked on the final conquest of the Indians as the inevitable triumph of civilization over barbarism. Others thought that it demonstrated nothing more than the ability of a powerful majority to destroy a weak minority. But regardless of how contemporaries regarded the passing of the Indian, two facts remain. A culture that had existed for centuries had been wiped out in 3 decades. So I guess, you know, we're not seeing the overtly racist language that we did a few decades before this, but what is this giving us? It's giving us 2 choices. One is that it was either the triumph of a greater civilization over one that was more barbaric, or that it was inevitable, that a powerful majority could destroy a weak minority. And whose story is it telling? It's the story of white America. It's also ignorant of a fact that there never was a single Indian culture. And it's inaccurate, of course, because neither Native peoples nor their cultures had been wiped out. And we'll take a look at one more. This one comes from a more recent textbook from United States History by Pearson, Prentice, and Hall. This is a chapter on the democracy in the age of Jackson, and a critical thinking question regarding the Trail of Tears asks, why do you think Americans were willing to give up new lands to the Indians? So again, the language is evolving somewhat, but what are the messages here? At first, it's not so problematic, but is it telling us that Native American history can only be told as it overlaps with the narrative of America's growth. Seems that Native Americans are being depicted as being in the way of American progress, and somehow that the United States tried to make amends and benevolently gave lands to Native Americans. What's missing from this narrative is that Native Americans actually had agency in their histories. They always have been active players in the shaping of their own lives and histories. It's incomplete. This question ignores the complex history of removal and treaty making, of the negotiations, the long history of Native American resistance to removal, and that treaties were the result of negotiations. Some of you may not know there were many kinds of exchanges that resulted from treaties, from lands to trade alliances, money, educational, and agricultural benefits. But the lands in Indian Territory were not a gift from the United States. So we'll take a minute, jump on for another chat with you. We'd like to ask the question, what did you first learn about Native Americans, and where did you learn it? So if you want to, we got great responses last time. I'd love to hear from you about your own educational experiences. What did you first learn, and where did you learn that? Seeing Pocahontas, Disney film, elementary school, context of pioneers and pilgrims, Thanksgiving, Western movies, going to a powwow, good for you. The Smith, dream catchers in elementary school, my family taught me, good. Lots of Thanksgiving, growing up in a community that was closer to Native Americans. 4th grade, learning about the Lenape and the Dutch. Lots of Thanksgiving. Akwesasne, good, upstate New York, growing up in rural paper bag costumes in school. That's a common one. Sherman Alexie in college poetry, but that was your first exposure. Living in Oklahoma. So we see a lot of commonality in some of these answers. I think one of the things that maybe is by far one of the most common is the Thanksgiving story in elementary school. Cowboy and Indian movies, cartoon characters on TV, Pocahontas when we learned about Jamestown, or the Native Americans perhaps in Boy Scouts or scouting. And some of you had more, I would call richer experiences, maybe growing up in communities where you are Native and you're learning about your culture, or you're in closer proximity to Native people and maybe have an opportunity to learn more. So thank you again for sharing those responses. And we're going to use that as a way to go on now and look at how this kind of education can affect our society today. One of the things that we wanted to do is some background research on exactly what textbooks today are covering. In 2012 and again in 2015, we took a look at, we analyzed the 28 of the most commonly used textbooks. It was an exhaustive analysis. We looked at every page, every grade level, and one of the most telling findings in this analysis was the list that you see on your screen. Are by far the most common narratives found about Native Americans in textbooks today. Now, to be fair, there are some exceptions, but these are the big ones. And I wonder what you might notice about this list. I can point out that everything up here, except for the last item, goes back 150 to thousands of years ago. So it's about Indians of the past. A good number of these stories are not really about Native Americans. As I pointed out earlier, they're about the building of America. A couple of these are about American Indians that are sort of heroes to the American heroines, in this case, to the stories of building America, Pocahontas and Sacagawea. Pocahontas because she helped at the Jamestown colony, and Sacagawea because she helped the Lewis and Clark expedition. And yeah, these are some of the same stories that you said you had learned in schools. But we have to ask this question, where are the Native American stories today? Where are the arts, the communities, the complex sovereign status of Native nations and their relationships with the United States and with state governments? Why do these stories, these 7 or 8 or 9 stories, persist across all publishers? State standards are equally problematic. This study, conducted by Dr. Sarah Scheer and some of her colleagues, looked at the 50 state history standards and came to basically the same conclusions as our textbook analysis. Indigenous people are portrayed in the past and a long since forgotten episode in the country's development, spoken about in broad general terms and blended with discussions of Euro-American destiny. So now I would like to turn my attention to what this type of education creates. What kinds of behavior does it create? What kinds of social issues do we find as a result of this kind of learning about Native people? Well, here we have the mascots issue. And if you believe the justifications that we often hear for these mascots, that this is somehow a way of honoring Native people. But think about this. Would we ever say the Cleveland Asians, the Cleveland Hispanics, the Cleveland Africans? So this findings from the American Psychological Association tell us that undermining the educational experience of members of all communities, especially those who've had little or no contact with indigenous peoples. These symbols, these images, these mascots teach non-Indian children that it's acceptable to participate in culturally abusive behavior, and that this perpetuates inaccurate misconceptions about American Indian culture. And that this, for Indian students, creates an unwelcome and often sometimes hostile learning environment. Dr. Stephanie Freiberg from the University of Arizona has said that American Indian mascots are harmful, not only because they're often negative, but because they remind and American Indians of the limited ways in which others see them. And this restricts the number of ways American Indians can see themselves. Overt racism. Halloween, for example, is still a favorite time to be pretend Indians. Here in this slide, Halloween revelers dress up as Dakota Access Pipeline protesters. Their signs, their costumes are clearly actually meant to demean what was recently a serious and meaningful issue among Native Americans, including many Native American youth. Not so overt racism can be biased or racist views that people may not even be aware that they have, but they distort reality. For example, high cheekbones and black hair maybe never was universally true for Native Americans, but it certainly is not true today. Some people like to attribute some magical, mystical qualities to Native Americans, such as they're all medicine men or highly spiritual and somehow very wise. I like that last one, very wise, but I don't know if it's true always. Native Americans are sometimes thought of as the world's first environmentalist, but that's a modern term that doesn't apply. It's an oversimplification of complex, long-standing cultural relationships with place. Native Americans are still thought of as warriors, the best fighters. But again, this is a stereotype that simplifies certain kinds of traditional roles in Native cultures. But American Indian kids are still subject to violence today because other kids think it's cool to fight an Indian. And then finally, we have this idea of Pocahontas. Native American women especially are highly sexualized. You can think of images that support this, even in the movie Pocahontas, with this cartooned Pocahontas running around the forest with her buckskin cocktail dress. Bad education about American Indians also has an impact on leaders at every level. People who make decisions, people who deal with the management of natural resources, legal issues of treaty rights, jurisdiction. Here, even a sitting president was unable to articulate what is meant by the sovereignty of native nations. In this example, Rand Paul said that if they, Native Americans, were assimilated within a decade, they'd probably be doing as well as the rest of us. This statement by another national political figure shows a serious lack of historical and cultural awareness. And it's reminiscent of those 19th and early 20th century policies and rhetoric that was used when the US government instituted destructive practices intended to erase Native cultures and to terminate tribal governments. A study of Native Americans in media found that contemporary Indians are represented 0% to 0.04% of the time. Everything else is historical. You can check this out. Just type the word American Indians or Native American in your Google search engine and look at the images that pop up on your screen. And you will see the vast majority of them are historical images, people in the past. So invisibility is another form of bias. Let's ask you for a little bit of chat on this question. Why do you think Native Americans are so invisible? We'd love to know your thoughts on this. Why are Native Americans so invisible? It's because we don't acknowledge them, their achievements, their practices, because they've been silenced, exactly. They're condemned to less than status because of white privilege, limited seats in government, not exposed to power or to the power. I think I'm seeing the European colonizers would have to own up to their wrongs. There would have to be some acknowledgement, wouldn't there, to recognize and to eliminate this invisibility. Wiped out in the urban fabric because of genocide, relegated to a lower caste, to the lowest caste. So yeah, again, these are all really astute and really very on point answers to this question of this ongoing problem of Native American invisibility. So let's go ahead and move forward. Every year at the museum, we get 1 million or so visitors. They come from all over the world. There's often a surprising level of ignorance. And these are just a few examples of the questions our interpretive staff face when they interact with visitors. And for Native American children, the consequences are often severe. When they see their communities as stereotyped or locked in the past, or when they don't see themselves at all, it leads to confusion, alienation, and other kinds of psychological and social issues. And for teachers themselves, who have themselves been educated with the lack of accurate and accurate, appropriate, and Native perspective, then they lack the personal knowledge and awareness of Native histories and cultures. We know that teachers distrust the resources that are available to them and really fear being offensive or inaccurate. So this causes a lot of teachers just to kind of skim the topic or maybe even skip it. So we want you to know that we don't do these kinds of analyses to make anyone feel personally guilty. Our purpose in this work, and why I've pointed out these narratives and the effects that they have on our society and on people, is to understand our history, to understand these narratives, and to move the conversation forward. We want to try to find solutions, and we want to establish new ways of educating about Native Americans. So in the remaining few minutes that I have, I would like to tell you about Native Knowledge 360. It's an initiative that we have at our museum to address this need for better education about Native peoples, to transform teaching and learning about Native Americans. So there are some components to this initiative that I'd like to share with you. The first bit of work is to replace the inaccurate, incomplete, and stereotypic stories about Native peoples. And so we developed a framework of essential understandings based on the 10 themes of the National Council for the Social Studies Standards. We wrote sample key concepts under each of these themes that you see here on the screen. We want educators to think about Native Americans in new ways, as diverse peoples and cultures across time and place, since time immemorial to the present day, that Native peoples are members of sovereign nations who've always had government systems, diplomacy with other nations, and are still nations today. That Native people generated and participated in international trade and economics, that Native Americans engineers built cities, that there were agronomists who developed crops that help feed the world today, that environmental managers created sustainable landscapes. And Native Americans, there are artists across time whose works belong in the world's great institutions of art. Contemporary people who live in the modern world, but deeply value and work to preserve their languages, cultures, and histories. We'd like to replace these typical stories in textbooks with this. And this document serves as a foundation for our work and helps others to begin thinking about Native Americans in much more expansive ways. You have a link to our essential understandings in the chat feature, and we also have it available in Spanish. Next, we're collaborating with Native communities to create new online lessons that offer a richer and more inclusive discourse and the voices of Native peoples. These resources are interactive. They employ, many of them, the powerful pedagogy of inquiry and utilize questions, rich primary and secondary sources, and tasks to build student skills, such as developing arguments based on evidence. You're going to be learning about one of these new online resources in our Native New York webinar next week. So we hope you'll join us for that one. We've also spent a lot of time talking and working and conducting research with teachers since our museum opened. The vast majority, we know, of teachers want to do the right thing. But we know that there's been very little in your professional training that support you or prepare you to assess the quality of the resources you use and to develop the confidence and skills you need to teach about Native histories, cultures, and contemporary lives. So we're offering, along with the online resources for the classrooms and for students, a variety of teacher professional development opportunities, including a summer institute, a resident teacher program, and numerous workshops at our two museums when we open back up, and of course, a variety of online professional development programs, such as the one you're participating in today. And finally, with Native Knowledge 360, we know that we're not the only ones at NMAI involved in improving education about Native Americans. There's a lot of effective work happening in Native communities themselves, in various state education agencies, in higher ed, and other organizations. So we have a variety of partnerships with like-minded organizations to help us raise the level of awareness and increase our reach and effectiveness, and to support one another. We have a long way to go to achieve social justice for Native Americans. In Native communities, there are still enormous disparities in health, economics, education, and other social issues. Some of these are real life or death challenges, such as the disappearance of untold number of American Indian and Alaska Native women and girls under suspicious circumstances. The disproportionate number of American Indians affected by the coronavirus, and the fact that, according to data from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, Native Americans are killed in police encounters at a higher rate than any other racial or ethnic group. But this issue is not only about Native Americans. It involves all people in the past and those who now make up the changing, complex, multifaceted, and highly multicultural place called the United States. Ultimately, it's about how we understand and tell our country's story. Real, substantive, and lasting change can only happen when we prioritize and institutionalize truth instead of racist views. And when we not only tolerate, but we actually embrace who we truly are and who we have been, then our education systems can follow. I think that education is where lasting hope for this lies. It's in those classrooms where children are educated, and the living rooms where they're being educated now, that we can finally remove the poisoned roots of racism and replace them with empathy, compassion, and equity. This object, this remarkable object, is from our NMAI collection that you see on the screen. It makes a powerful statement about the many different but connected parts of the United States. It's called Nations. It was created in 2002 by a Ute artist, Jenny Ann Chapus Taylor. She used 131,000 beads to weave the stripes and initials of the 50 states. But in detail that you cannot even see, it also includes the names of 456 Native American nations, along with 4 statements that to the artist exemplify what it means to be American. One of those statements is, "Now join hand in hand, brave Americans all. By uniting we stand, by dividing we fall." And that was from John Dickinson in 1768. So we'd like to ask you to join us in this work. You can help us build new, more complete and accurate American narrative and social justice for Native Americans. So there may be time for a couple of quick questions. I will open up my Q&A screen so I can see these. There's a question, as educators, how can we help with Native Knowledge 360 and getting our school systems to change the curriculum? Yes, there are lots of ways that you can help. First, starting with your own classroom, and by building awareness among your colleagues. Encourage others in your schools or your school districts to attend our professional development programs. the opportunity to participate in our annual institutes, and to access the variety of sources that we have available to help with things like terminology and a variety of activities that can be used in classrooms to replace the ones that and then that have been commonly used. And then thinking about your curriculum, be an advocate for change to standards, change, and use those essential understandings that I pointed out to you. Those have actually been used in a variety of school districts and even at some states when new standards are being adopted, to get away from those common stories and those common narratives, really open up to more expansive and inclusive language about Native Americans. I see a question: is there a place online that provides the description of the nation's flag and the quoted text? As far as I know, there is not, but this broadcast will be recorded and available to you as a recording after this event. So you'll have the opportunity to access this information again. I see a question here about reading that the Clovis hypothesis is being challenged by new archaeology suggesting much earlier arrival dates of people to the American continents. Do you have recommendations on up-to-date assessments for the peopling of the Americans? That's a really interesting question, and there's a lot of ways to think about this. Native Americans view these theories of say the Bering Strait and the idea of the Clovis as the earliest peoples populating. A lot of Native Americans instead rely on their traditional stories, on their own creation stories, the stories that tell them they were created in these places, and that those are the stories that they hold truest to their hearts. But we also acknowledge science, and we know that science doesn't know everything yet. So this is an evolving story, and science is beginning to reveal evidence of Native peoples here earlier, and through DNA analysis, looking at the migrations of populations from potentially from previously unrecognized places, such as the Iberian Peninsula to the east coast of the Americas. So there's lots of, I don't have specific examples to cite, but there's lots of anthropological literature out there about this, this ongoing work. And I think it's really, really interesting and important work. So we are just about to the end of our time. I do want to say thank you to Johanna Gorelick, Amy Temerens, and Carrie Gonzalez for their work to produce and support this presentation, along with my other NMAI colleagues who've been supporting the chat and Q&A today. Most importantly, I want to thank those Native peoples and communities who've entrusted us with their stories and with their rich histories and cultures. It's an honor for us to serve you. And thank you all again for your time and attention today. Thank you for the great participation. We want to ask you to have a safe and healthy day. We hope to see you back here next week. Mado. Thank you.
Thank you, Ed, for really inspiring us to think about really what transformations we can make in our own teaching and learning about Native Americans. And we can continue the conversation next week in our fourth and final webinar in our series. So we hope that you're able to join us next Thursday, October 15th at 4 p.m. Eastern, where we'll focus on the museum's digital lesson, Did Native People Really Sell Manhattan? Which is a lesson that's designed to complement the New York City and New York State 4th and 5th grade social studies curriculum. We'll be posting a link to register for this webinar in the chat. Thank you all so much for joining us.